Ever try stuffing a gaming console, like the whole thing, into a file smaller than a cat meme?
You're kidding, right?
I'm serious. That's basically the JS13K games competition make a game, but it's gotta be only 13 kilobytes of data.
Wow, 13 kilobytes. That's like, what, the size of a short text document?
Exactly, it's wild. And that's why we're diving into Space Huggers.
Okay, I've heard of this one. Yeah.
You've provided us with the game itself on Newgrounds, the developers' blog posts, the GitHub repository. It's amazing.
We've got a backstage pass for this one, for sure. And it's a good thing, too, because just looking at the surface, Space Huggers is impressive, winning awards in the competition and getting a dedicated fan base.
It's even more impressive when you realize this isn't some simple little game. We're talking a full-on run-and-gun rogue-like platformer, like Contra or Metal Slug, but with levels that are different every time you play.
Yeah, and you know what's crazy? The developer, Frank Force, actually built a custom game engine, Little.js, just for this competition.
Wait, hold on. He built a whole game engine on top of making the game? Who does that?
Right. Talk about dedication. He actually mentions in his blog that he used up half the competition time before even starting on the game itself. He wanted to get that foundation right, maximize the size and performance.
Okay, so that's some next-level planning right there. But Little.js isn't some bare-bones engine, right? What's he packing in there?
It's surprisingly sophisticated. He's using WebGL for the graphics, ZZFX, to make those sound effects, even created a whole physics system for character movement, explosions, all that.
Wow. Talk about making every single byte count. And speaking of squeezing things in, we got to talk about the art. It's got that classic retro feel, 16-bit, but how do you even create art with that little space?
It takes some serious creativity. He uses a 16-color pixel art sprite sheet, which is basically like a digital artist's palette. Every single visual element has to fit on this one grid.
So every pixel is like gold, but even with pixel art, you still got animation. How do you animate characters and stuff without going over the limit?
Well, he got super creative. Instead of tons of frames for a rolling animation, he just rotates the character. Most animations only have 2 frames, max, just to conserve space.
Man, talk about thinking outside the sprite sheet. But it's not just about the technical stuff. This game's got some personality. Those blinking eyes, the explosions that linger, the little detail.
Absolutely. It adds to that classic game feel. And he even uses procedurally generated running animations. Makes the characters feel kind of quirky. And those lingering particle effects make your actions feel like they have weight.
Yeah, the world feels so much more alive, even if it is just a bunch of pixels. Speaking of making an impact, the gameplay here is surprisingly intense.
Well, it's that classic run and gun, right? Metal Slug, that kind of vibe.
Yeah.
But then you add in the roguelike stuff, levels changing, permadeath that keeps you on your toes.
So you're thrown into a level, no idea what to expect.
Exactly. Every playthrough is different. New enemy locations, item spawns, gotta adapt on the fly.
Sounds like you need lightning reflexes. But with levels being random, how do you make sure the difficulty feels fair, balanced?
He's got this set of rules for how the levels are made. So yeah, the layout's random, but the core stuff, enemy bases, obstacles, follows a certain logic.
So it's like controlled chaos. There's a method to the madness.
Exactly. Can't just have things be completely random.
And judging from the reviews on Newgrounds, he nailed it. Now, we've talked about the technical stuff, the gameplay, but let's talk enemies. Even with the limited space, he's got a good variety.
Oh, for sure. And they all act differently, have their own attack patterns. You've got your basic grunts, easy to take down. But then there's the captains who can climb walls. And then you've got those specialists, tiny little ninjas, dodging your shots like crazy.
Oh, tell me about it. Those guys are a nightmare in those tight spaces. But you know what really got me? The destructible environments. It's not just for show, it's part of the gameplay.
Right. Classic run and gun stuff. He talks about it in his blog, wanting to make these like chain reaction moments. One shot takes out a whole bunch of enemies.
Yeah, you were right to point out that blog post. It's fascinating, like how he uses procedural generation for the levels.
Super smart move, especially with the size limit. Instead of storing every single level, he's got these rules, these algorithms, to make them on the fly.
So the game's like, got a set of building blocks and just goes wild with them. But wouldn't that make the levels feel samey, since they come from the same rules?
Not at all. There's so much variation, complexity in those rules. Different enemy placements, the terrain changes, even little hidden rooms, branching paths. You never know what you're going to get.
Controlled chaos, huh? Gotta have some method to the madness, I guess.
Exactly. He even talks about using, get this, random noise algorithms for the terrain.
Wait, seriously, that sounds insanely complicated.
It is, but he explains it really well in the blog, even if you're not a programmer.
Hmm.
He's basically making these height maps using math, And the game turns those into the mountains, canyons,
Yeah.
the actual scenery.
It's like he's sculpting with math. That's incredible. Which actually brings up a good point. How do you cram all this stuff, code, art, sound, into 13 kilobytes? That's nuts.
That's where the real technical magic comes in. This super intricate build process, minifying the code, squeezing down those images, even making the sound effects procedurally.
Hold on, minifying code. What is that like, translating it into some secret computer language?
Haha, no, not exactly. More like giving it a super intense edit, removing all the extra spaces, comment stuff that's helpful for us, but the computer doesn't need, like shrinking a novel down to a haiku.
Okay, that makes sense. And what about those procedurally generated sound effects? What does that even mean?
So instead of using huge sound files, he uses this tool, ZZFX. It makes the sounds using code based on a bunch of parameters way more efficient.
So he's basically writing music, but with code. That guy's a wizard. No wonder he could fit so much in.
Right. It's not just about cramming things in. It's about being smart about it. He even says in his blog, even after all that, still had to make tough calls, what to include, what to cut.
It's like trying to fit, like, your whole life into a tiny suitcase.
And yet he made this awesome game, super fun, people love it. Just goes to show limitations can make you more creative.
It's like they say limitations, they kind of force you to think differently, right? Speaking of different, let's get into how this actually plays. You mentioned that run and gun style, what makes it so satisfying, and how do you make it work in such a small package?
Well, when it's done right, there's just something about those controls, that instant feedback, it just feels good.
Yeah, you really feel that speed, that power blasting through.
Exactly. And Frank Force nailed it there. Controls are super responsive, intuitive. You always feel in control, even when it's crazy hectic.
I was going to say it's fast-paced, but never felt unfair,
Exactly. He walked that line perfectly challenging, but you can learn from mistakes. Good level design, for sure.
It's not just running and gunning, though. There's the rogue-like thing. That permadeath adds a whole other level, right?
Absolutely. Every life matters.
Right.
One wrong move, you're back to square one.
Yeah.
Keeps the tension up.
Really clever how he brought those two together, old school, arcade, and modern roguelike. Fresh take. But we've geeked out enough about the technical stuff. What about the feel of the game? What makes this little game so special?
For me, it's how he made a complete experience. With all those limitations, space huggers. It's not just impressive technically, it's about creativity, ingenuity. Proves you don't need a zillion dollars and a huge team to make something great.
And the fact that people loved it on Newgrounds even got the speedrunners going. Says a lot.
It's the kind of game that hooks you from the start, keeps you coming back, even when you think you've seen it all.
So as we're wrapping up this deep dive into space huggers, what are the big takeaways for our listeners?
First off, never underestimate limitations. Sometimes those make you even more creative.
Necessity is the mother of invention, right?
Exactly. And this game proves it. Also, don't be afraid to learn from the classics. Those old games are classics for a reason.
They're just fun. And lastly, I gotta say, passion goes a long way. This guy, Frank Force, he poured his heart into this, you can tell. Every pixel, every line of code.
He saw a challenge, took it head on.
Yeah.
Created something really special. That's inspiring, honestly, whether you make games or not.
Absolutely. So next time you're facing a challenge, think of Frank Force and his tiny game. Space Huggers proves that we can do anything if we are creative, and that even the smallest things can have a big impact.
It's about pushing those boundaries, no matter how small they seem. You never know what you might create.
Well said. And on that note, we'll wrap up this deep dive into the amazing world of tiny game dev and the incredible story of Space Huggers. Until next time, keep exploring, keep creating, and never stop pushing those boundaries.